Weliexik bugam sit nogma. Wuktit danwen monenuik, Dalhousie Victoria LaBillois Mizel, Gespegawagi Tleawi, Akwigilistiguch, Nigan Bugui Wejibek Excavation, Wajuzik Construction. Good morning and welcome. My name is Victoria LaBillois. I'm coming to you live from the Listigus First Nation, located at the heart of Gespegawagi, the seventh and largest district of Mi'kma'ki, the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you to the University of New Brunswick and Dalhousie University for hosting today's panel as part of their new project to increase diversity and inclusion in their business programs. The Promise Scholar Initiative is an Atlantic Canadian business school project led by Dalhousie University, and this was created to help recruit, retain, and support more Black and Indigenous students by offering financial aid and wraparound supports at the undergraduate and graduate level in business schools. Today's topic is equity, diversity, and inclusion. And we've chosen as a theme for our panel today, the theme of moving forward together. Increasing diversity and inclusion in our business schools and business community is essential for ongoing growth and prosperity in our region. Together, we can make a difference by strengthening business programs and ultimately helping to create more inclusive businesses. The Promise Initiative will help increase awareness about the ethical, social, and economic value of diversity in the business community, and also the impact that Promise Scholars can have. There's many angles that we could discuss EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion. We could look at its challenges. We could look at the different lenses of how we each perceive EDI policies or how we've experienced these initiatives. We could look at the value of cultural perspectives and the voices brought to the table. Economic reconciliation is another discussion point through EDI. Innovation, problem solving through different worldviews. We could look at the entrepreneurial spirit of Black and Indigenous peoples. And we saw growth of this entrepreneurial spirit through the pandemic. So we're seeing the economic resilience come from this. We could look at EDI to understand what we've learned so far, what's worked, what hasn't worked, where can we do better? And we could also look beyond equity, diversity, and inclusion policies as a simple checkbox or checkmark task that has to be completed. So let's get this conversation started by meeting our panelists. I'm very excited to be joined today by both Todd Ross and Mike Hennessey. And I know that our viewers have had the opportunity to read the bios of our panelists. Those were in the marketing materials and again in the registration packages. So I want to do things a little differently and help understand what has helped to shape the perspective of today's panelists. So I'm going to ask you both to tell us a little bit about yourselves. Specifically, if you could share with us a story of how equity, diversity, and inclusion policies or initiatives have impacted your lived experience and brought you to the point where you are today. So this could be the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're going to call this segment of today's panel, The Truth Before Reconciliation. Let's start with you, Todd.
Sure. Yeah, and I'll start off with the ugly. So very early in my career, so my very first job was in the Canadian Armed Forces. And about a year into my position, I started to be investigated. And I went through an 18-month investigation, which is now known as the LGBT purge, and was kicked out of the military because I was gay. So that was 30 some years ago. The policy's since changed. But as a result of that experience, it drastically changed my life. One, I had a sudden career shift. But later in my life, a few years ago, I actually took the opportunity to sue the federal government and win in a class action lawsuit. But as a result of that early experience, it's made me a bit of an activist. And throughout my career, I've always kind of had that activist spirit in the work that I do, as well as my volunteer activities.
Thank you, Todd, for sharing a personal story like that. Very sorry to hear about that experience, but how it has shaped you to the positive, how you took that and brought it forward into something that could help everybody grow. Thank you. Mike, share with us a story, please.
Yeah, and thank you, Victoria. And I want to echo what you said, and Todd. Sorry to hear that you had to experience that, but it sounds like you've come through it and strength, and with the strength that you had, and you're sharing that today. So thank you for that. For I guess I'll go to the middle, the bad and the good. We'll try and do a little bit of both. And so my career began after I finished my undergraduate about 12 years ago. And I was my first job out of university actually was thanks to DEI sorts of initiatives that were happening at the time as an Indigenous intern in an economic development organization. And that has led through to where I am today, really, and significantly impacted my career. And so that's been a good influence on my life from that perspective, giving me as an Indigenous recent graduate an opportunity through the Indigenous internship program in the province of New Brunswick. And that program actually still is active today. So that's a good experience that I've had, and I'm thankful for that. A little bit on the bad side, one of the things that I've experienced a lot through my career, but also in my education background, going through school, was there was a lot of assumptions that were put upon me as an Indigenous person, assumptions about, things that my values, my beliefs, who I am. And, as soon as somebody found out I was Mi'kmaq, there was some assumptions. They thought, oh, you must be into this, you must be into that. And so that's a little bit of the bad side. And it really helped sharpen me in my identity as an individual of who am I, what are my values, and to be confident enough to share that and even combat some stereotypes and some assumptions that people make about us as Indigenous peoples as a teenager and even into today. So that's a little bit of the good and a little bit of the bad of what I've had to experience. But I'll leave it at that and turn it back to you, Victoria.
Thank you, Mike. So we see the good that can come out of EDI initiatives, helping to launch your career fresh out of university. And certainly as a recent grad, you're looking for that boost, right? So I'm happy it was of service. But I think it's a common experience to your experience that it's 2022, but we still see these nasty type of stereotypes existing and confronting us sometimes when we least expect it, and we're busy and getting the work done, and then you're slammed with a question like, where did that come from? So let me share a quick story with you about my early experience. I was similar to you, Mike. I was fresh out of my undergrad at UNB, and I'd moved to Ottawa to work for the federal government, starting as a summer student and then getting picked up full time. And one day, the director of the program, so my boss's boss, comes to my office and asked me if I had a university degree. And I was quite proud. I said, yes, I do. And talking about it, he says, well, why don't you frame it and put it up, hang it up here in your office? And I'm thinking, okay, I could do that. And of course, fresh out of university, I was still a little poor student adapting. And I did that, but I didn't ask the question why. Maybe I should have, because it haunted me after when I thought about why would he want me to hang my degree on the wall? What different? Am I not doing a good job? Come to understand from the hurt that I felt was people thought I got the job simply because I was an Indigenous woman that I didn't merit or I didn't earn or deserve the job. And you know, that's the ugly side or the flip side of the EDI coin. So that has shaped my experiences and demonstrated to me that I must work harder and smarter, and I needed to demonstrate why I'm in that position. So thank you for sharing, and thank you being candid about sharing your personal experiences, because they've shaped us all and they continue to shape us all with these experiences. So I want to start our conversation with a quote, I should say a paraphrase. I have a quote from the former New Brunswick Lieutenant Governor, the Honorable Graydon Nicholas, proud Wolastoqiyik from the Nagutkut First Nation. So in a recent commencement address, Graydon reminded us that education leads to liberation and renewed relationships. I just love those words. So if we think about this and apply it to today's conversation from an economic perspective and a business education could lead to liberation from managing poverty, something we see too often, and it could lead to renewed relationships around abundance. So my first question, thinking about this quote, many people, many businesses, SME, small, medium, large, even many business schools know the pressures today of exploring and implementing equity, diversity, and inclusion policies. There's significant competition on this landscape for the resources, and some people argue that EDI has become commoditized, meaning it's more of a checkbox, or we have to do this and we have to market this, look how great we are. How does that translate, right? So in your mind, what is an effective way that we could move forward with EDI in business education? And I'll start with you, Mike.
Sure. I mean, that's a big question. So hopefully we can start to scratch the surface and start some thoughts to be provoked in the people watching. But there is a lot of pressure around DEI. And I do agree with what Graydon Nicholas had said around education leading to liberation and renewed relationships. There's an economic liberation that comes from our communities taking advantage of economic opportunity, and us as individuals taking advantage of business opportunities, and part of that is being educated in these fields. And so one thing that I'll share, I guess, one of the things that we're doing with the University of New Brunswick right now is something that I think is important, and we're starting to in the business or in the management faculty. I got to make sure it's not business administration anymore; it's management. In the management faculty is to start to incorporate Indigenous ways of knowing into course content, not just in specific, courses that are titled, this is an Indigenous course, but just having an acknowledgement and also incorporating Indigenous worldviews and perspectives on economies, on building economies, on the values that are found in our communities. Not to overgeneralize, but generally, increase focus on the bottom line, triple bottom lines, not just profitability, but also the people and the environment. That business is more than just profitability. It's also about building people, and it's about protecting the environment. And so those are some perspectives that we're starting to bring in, and we've developed an entrepreneurship course, a dual credit course that incorporates Indigenous perspectives into Western worldviews of entrepreneurship, and looking forward to further collaborations like that, and so that it's not just a placeholder for a certain number of seats for Indigenous people. It's ensuring that from whatever background, whatever culture, that all cultures and all backgrounds are respected in the course content itself. I know some institutions or some organizations will have, a certain number of seats set aside for just a certain type of person, which I see why that's going on. But that in and of itself doesn't rectify some of the challenges with DEI. We have to be represented, all cultures, all backgrounds, to be represented within curriculums, within staffing, and within the student body. And so that's what kind of where I would start with moving forward in an effective way with EDI and business education.
That is exciting to hear about this course. That's amazing. And Mike, you've pointed out to us in the spectrum, let's say if we look at the early days of inclusion, you referenced, okay, we're going to put away three seats in business school for Black students and 3 seats for Indigenous students. That was a starting point 20 years ago. But on the spectrum now, we're weaving ways of indigenous ways of knowing and being into the actual curriculum to enrich and create a more robust dialogue. And if I could just add something to how we could further add value, is looking at Indigenous methods of teaching, which we know if you approach an elder and you're asking questions, they're not going straight for the answer. They're going to tell you this roundabout story and take you down this path and go all over. And it's for you to figure out in there, where's the answer. And isn't that the essence of critical thinking, of taking information and figuring it out? And you're guided, but you're not told that answer. So that is just exciting. Todd, would you like me to repeat the question?
No, I'll add on to what Mike said, and it's an excellent point, and something that I think we need to look at all of the curriculum and really kind of look at that, ensuring that we do see all communities reflected in, I think we need to work with elders, we need to work with community, that it's, my role here at the university as the Indigenous advisor, it shouldn't be my voice telling what needs to be changed in curriculum. It needs to be a community effort. It needs to be a partnership with community and with the school to bring them in, so that we're all working together and looking at that curriculum and where we can change. There's an expression in the Métis community that, for so long we relied on the buffalo in the West as our resource. And when the buffalo died, when the buffalo were all killed, the expression became, education will be our new buffalo. And looking at education as the opportunity for our communities to grow. So when we look at the curriculum and ensure that there's inclusion, ensure that there's community involvement, and also I think ensuring that there's connections beyond school, so that while we're in, while students are in university studying this, and the university can be doing the absolute best programs and best efforts to ensure EDI, if the university then puts you into community that has no connection to EDI, and suddenly you're left kind of probably in a worse position where you could be. So I think building those connections beyond school, so that we can be leaders in the business communities as well, to ensure that that students are successful once they leave school.
Good points you raised there, Todd. And I'm thinking of, to your comment about your role as Indigenous advisor. You can't be the only voice in there that is espousing the value or putting this forward. And I think to an earlier comment you made, Mike, about what you might hear as an Indigenous person, either in business school or in the business community. If you're the only business or the Indigenous person in the room, everybody will look at you for the answers to speak on behalf of the entire Indigenous community. It's a tremendous pressure, and one that I don't know anybody wants to take that role on, because you need to necessarily involve community, involve the speakers of the language, the knowledge holders, the elders. There are many voices that would come together to make this, to enrich this initiative, versus just one, if I could say, token voice at that. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I want to shift the conversation now and turn our attention to the 2015 calls to action from the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I know both of you are very familiar with the Call to Action 92, which calls on corporate Canada to take action. And it's funny how we can enumerate these calls to action. I work with them on a number of occasions, but what I did to prepare for today is comb through them very carefully and look if there were any calls to action that would be relevant to today's conversation. So give me a moment here, and I'm just going to refresh you on a few of these calls to action which are relevant for today's conversation. So call to action number 11 calls upon the federal government to provide adequate funding to end the backlog of First Nation students seeking a post-secondary education. Call to action number 16 calls upon post-secondary institutes to create university and college degree and diploma programs in Indigenous languages. Call to action number 28. This is an interesting one. It's a call to action specific to law schools in Canada to require all law students to take a course on Indigenous people in the law, which includes the history and legacy of residential schools, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, treaties, Aboriginal rights, Indigenous law, Indigenous Crown relations. This will require skills-based training in intercultural competency, conflict resolution, human rights, and anti-racism. Call to action number 62 calls upon the government to provide necessary funding to post-secondary institutions to educate teachers on how to integrate Indigenous knowledge, what Mike was talking about, and teaching methods into the classroom. And finally, call to action number 65, calling upon the federal government through SSHRC and in collaboration with Indigenous people and post-secondary institutes and others to establish a national research program with multi-year funding to advance understanding of reconciliation. So we have some potential solutions that have been floating around since 2015 with this important report and calls to actions. So applying this to a business education lens, I want to hand you both a magic pen, and together we're going to draft a call to action to Atlantic Canadian business schools. Let's make it larger, to business schools on how to be more inclusive. Who wants to start with that? Who wants to hold that magic pen?
Can we only write one?
We can write as many as we want, keeping in mind we only have an hour.
Right. Well, I'll start this time. I think within the existing calls, I mean, a lot of consultation went into this. A lot of voices were heard, and a lot of deep thought went into bringing forward some of the best recommendations. Funding is absolutely important, and I think that's one of the great things of the Promise Scholarship the Promise Scholars is that it provides additional funding. I would love to see requirements of an Indigenous course for all students, including Indigenous language, and included in that would be an element of experiential learning. So that's where I'll start.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there if that's all right. I do have a background also in duty to consult, and how that impacts economic development, how that impacts resource development in our communities. And I think, around business education, there has to be an enhanced understanding of our treaties, of the peace and friendship treaties, of how the protections are in place for food, social, and ceremonial rights to be exercised, moderate livelihood rights to be exercised, and how those are protected within our treaties, which were written, a few hundred years ago, but still are enforced and in place for us. Our ancestors were had a lot of foresight when they signed those. And so those need to be included in business law courses, and law courses overall, period, not just in the Indigenous component of an Indigenous law course, but if you're looking at economic development law, business law, those things have a significant impact in a lot of different sectors. And so whether you're Indigenous, non-Indigenous, or other backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, there needs to be an awareness of that, because that's just the law of our country, the law of the land. And so understanding of the peace and friendship treaties and our shared histories here on the East Coast is very important, especially in business development on the East Coast, because our treaties are very different from the numbered treaties, very different from other parts of the world. And so to have an understanding of the uniqueness of those peace and friendship treaties and what they safeguard, what they protect, and how that duty to consult is carried out, who is responsible, what is the Crown's responsibility, what is a proponent's responsibility, what is our Indigenous community's responsibility, because we have a responsibility there too. And I think that awareness and understanding, the increase of that awareness and understanding, will help with relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities and proponents in resource development projects and in other sorts of projects and environmental protections for the foreseeable future. So if I could write a recommendation, it'd be around that too.
I think we're going to need a few calls to action here. So I'm just pulling out a few of the comments, and Todd has reminded us that we need, first of all, that space to create this type of programming and the necessary funding supports and the champions to make sure that this isn't a one-of, that it continues to grow and evolve as our understanding does. And you've raised the point too, Mike, about the duty to consult. So I think if we're building greater understanding about what this duty is amongst business students, because we're shaping future business leaders, future CEOs, future C-suite executives. So having that fundamental understanding and being able to talk about it openly, and to be able to feel safe to ask these types of questions rather than resenting it, or what we see maybe sometimes in some of the comments of newspaper articles. And I know they say don't read the comments, but why don't they just get over it? Why do they need special treatment? I mean, ad nauseum, right? We continue to hear these, but if we start at a fundamental level and create that understanding and space to talk about these issues, I think another starting point too is one of my passion projects is teaching financial literacy to youth. And it's changing. It doesn't start with expenses and budgets and this and that. It starts with the relationship with money, how they feel towards money, and getting at the Indigenous worldview of wealth. So I think if we were to have a call to action to business schools, part of this education for business students around an Indigenous economy would be at the beginning to understand there was an extermination of Indigenous economies, and it was purposeful, it was targeted. And following the extermination of our Indigenous economies, our traditional economies, which we did have, there was a subsequent exclusion of our people from the colonial economy that emerged. And that exclusion came through many forms of legislation, some of which are still on the books today. So fundamentally, there's a whole spectrum that could inform future business leaders through this education of understanding how Indigenous people came to be today. Any comments on that?
Absolutely. I was thinking as you're talking, Victoria, that there's also, there was the forced extermination of Indigenous cultures and societies and economies. And an understanding that there was a diversity of views of what economic development was pre-contact. Indigenous communities weren't just all uniform. There was diversities of opinions. There was diversities of economic systems across both Atlantic Canada, but across all of Turtle Island. And so an understanding that, we as Indigenous peoples are not just, we don't all share exactly the same worldviews. You can't just paint us all with this broad brush, and understanding that has been the case since before contact. And what colonialism was all about was fitting us into these boxes, fitting us into these reservations, and making us all the same, quote unquote. in the government's eyes, when there's a lot of diversity within our communities that we need to recognize and celebrate as well when it comes to business and the views of economy building. And there's no perspective that's better than the other. There's Indigenous communities that want to build pipelines. There's Indigenous communities that are totally against pipelines, and that's fine. There's differences in opinions, and each communities and each nation makes those decisions. So I'll leave it at that.
I'm glad you added that, Mike, because it could exist at a basic level that people think there's a pan-Indigenous identity without realizing that there are indeed 3 distinct nations recognized in the Constitution: First Nation, Inuit, and Métis peoples, that there is no one Indigenous lens to look through. And I think this came to light for me. Remember when the land acknowledgements, I go back to 2017, when they were becoming de rigueur, and non-Indigenous people were scrambling, well, how am I going to know whose territory I'm on? And there is no one land acknowledgement that exists for all our Indigenous brothers and sisters from coast to coast to coast. You need to know whose traditional territory you're on. And there are different language groups. There are different approaches to economic development. There is such a diversity just in the Indigenous world. So thank you for raising that, Mike. Todd, I want to pass the floor to you.
Sure. Yeah, and building on that, here in St. John, people often say there is no Indigenous community in St. John and it's long gone. I hear that so often, and the reality is there's a very large Indigenous community in St. John, and it's made up of people from communities across the country, nations across the country, as through the efforts of colonization, and there is very little support in the city as a result. And so when we look at urban communities, I think it's something that we also need to be aware of through business schools, is the potential within these vibrant urban communities in basically every town and city across Canada, that there is tremendous opportunity to be working within urban communities, but also the diversity reflected within those communities is key. It's when you look around St. John, there's a very large Inuit community in St. John, larger in proportion to the community in Toronto. But people just automatically assume we don't see Indigenous community here, so therefore it is not here. And then business responses often, we don't have a responsibility because there is no community here.
Right. Thank you for raising that too. So understanding that even within the First Nation community, Mi'kmaq, Wolastoqiyik, we have a portion of our population that lives in community or on reserve and living in urban centers, rural areas, that there is no one cultural identity or definition that can capture our people and the beauty of our people. I want to move on to my next question here, just looking at our time, which is going so quickly. So I want to shift to policies, specifically policies. And we know it's important to make policies, but when these policies translate to boots on the ground or seats in the classroom, how do we make sure that these policies are meaningful to people? How can we change business education so that it's not just numbers or numbers of seats in this program? How do we do that? Anybody want to start?
Sure, I'll go. I think it goes back to cultural connections, community. There needs to be an understanding. You don't really get an understanding by reading a book in all cases. That there needs to be opportunity, and I mentioned before the experiential learning opportunities. That to get that two-eyed seeing approach, to get that understanding, there needs to be involvement in community, there needs to be involvement with community, and there needs to be connection to the land as part of the education, so that we, while books are very important and lectures are very important, that we have that opportunity to learn from the land. We have that opportunity to learn from elders and knowledge keepers as part of the education.
Interesting. Yeah. Taking it from the one-dimensional, here's your reading material for the week. We're going to learn about the duty to consult versus sitting in a circle out on the land and hearing from knowledge holders, making it multidimensional and being safe to ask questions. Mike?
Yeah, kind of tying in with what you both were discussing, hands-on in the field sorts of education. First of all, that's more effective than textbook classroom education. Anyways, that's cross-culturally, but it's also, that's something that we can put in. And I think that post-secondary institutions are really growing in this area. They're trying anyways. There's on the land sorts of education programs that are starting to be discussed. I know there's one happening right now in Oromocto First Nation, which is where my office is here in Oromocto. So they're doing a First Nations leadership and governance program, which incorporates land-based learning. And right now, from my understanding, it's only available for Indigenous students. But what a privilege and amazing thing it would be to expand those sorts of programs, because land-based learning would be so effective for all students, from whatever your background is. And it's an effective way of teaching, way more than. And I'll go back to my business law days, where we would just open the textbook literally in the beginning of every class to where we had left off last class, and read out loud the textbook for 3 hours. That was wow. I just drive an ice pick into my ear hole. Like I think that'd be more exciting than than that. And so on the land, learning from elders around business law, even something as dry as business law, you can make it more exciting, hands-on, applicable. And as far when it comes to policies, I just wanted to share something, and I'm going to drop it into our private chat. And I don't know if the folks can share it in the comments or not, but there's a reconciliation report that I was a part of in 2017 that looked at the how policies can be enhanced and advanced for in the workforce perspective and also in community economic development perspective. And so I shared that link, and I was part of that research team that developed that. And so there's some calls to action in there also, that we took feedback from employers, government departments, Indigenous community representatives, Indigenous organizations in that room on that day. And we asked them some serious questions around what sorts of calls to action, what sorts of policies, what sorts of recommendations would you like to see to implement the TRC calls to action into the workforce and into economic development. And so the results of that are in that link. And I encourage, if you want to learn more about it, just go and read through that. It was a really informative day. And as from the policy side, there might be some things you can glean from it. So,
Mike, I always learn from you. You seem to always have your hand in some great innovation. Talking about this leadership program on the land, it just makes me want to return to the classroom. And of course, we can all reflect back on what our education, our formal education looked like in a classroom. But I just got this strong visual of being out on the land. And as you said, taking even the driest material, but bringing that to life from a fresh perspective that people might not even think would exist. And I'm speaking of the Indigenous lens here, of course, with knowledge holders and knowledge keepers. That's just amazing. Todd, you had mentioned two-eyed seeing, and for the benefit of our viewers, I want to expand a bit more upon that theory. Of course, we know our from Albert Marshall and the late Merdina Marshall, all the extensive work they did on Edwunkamunk, two-eyed seeing. Just share with our viewers a little bit more on this. Thank you.
Yeah, and the idea that when generally universities take a Western approach, that in education, probably say all universities take a Western approach in education, and applying to an Indigenous approach as well, so that we're looking out of one eye at the Western view and one eye with the Indigenous view, or a Wabanaki view, so that as we're going through the process of earning a degree, that you have both perspectives throughout that time, so that when you eventually graduate, you can then approach with we often use the expression in Métis, with a foot in each canoe. So you can approach with your Western as well as an Indigenous viewpoint going forward.
And both have value.
Yes.
Yeah.
And thinking of, the tremendous education we can learn from elders and knowledge keepers, and the stories and that have been passed down through generations, that are embedded in there, that from a Western perspective, they just ignore them and think, oh, cute story, let's publish a book about it. But the knowledge that is within that elders and knowledge keepers can help us understand and translate into an education.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for expanding our understanding there. So, gentlemen, our time has quickly come to an end here. I'm going to open the floor now to questions. And I understand there are quite a few that have been coming in here. So here is our first question. Okay. The Atlantic Indigenous Economic Development Integrated Research Program, ADERP, has recently become an eligible institution for SSHRC funding. Being that we serve our Atlantic Indigenous leaders and communities, how do you think we should approach this opportunity to better support Indigenous research and Indigenous researchers? Anybody want to begin?
Sure, I'll jump in, and I think that we need to remember the "nothing about us without us" principle. That if we're doing Indigenous research, we have to involve Indigenous community. We have to involve those knowledge keepers as well as elders, and there needs to be as well an Indigenous ethics protocol around any research that's done.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely, and just kind of to add on to that as well, the support for Indigenous research. I know ADERP's been around for a while, and it's exciting. That's exciting news that you're now an eligible institution for SSHRC funding. I remember working alongside ADERP and UNB on a couple of projects in the past, and so that's an exciting step in the right direction. So you're doing your job. You're doing your part, ADERP, as an Indigenous entity in this space. But also, I think there's a lack of capacity around Indigenous research capacity. And so building opportunities in our post-secondary institutions for research assistant positions, TA positions, building space for capacity to be developed, Indigenous capacity to be developed in this space, so that we can more and more realize the aspiration of nothing about us without us. Because sometimes I think we just have, there's research that happens, and institutions and research teams have the best of intentions to engage Indigenous researchers, but they have a hard time finding enough or finding available Indigenous researchers. I've just had that challenge myself with a recent project that I've been brought into on working with the Wabanaki Council on Disabilities and trying to find Indigenous capacity for research across Atlantic Canada, and to build that talent pool, if you will, not to sound callous, but to build that talent pool of individuals that have those skills and capacities, understand the ethics, and are from our communities, and can support the work that ADERP is doing. So I think the institutions play a role, ADERP, as well as within any SSHRC funding that you get, having capacity building is part of it.
I share that sentiment. I'm so proud of ADERP I think of the spectrum we referenced earlier, where EDI started as a couple of seats reserved for Black or Indigenous students, and now we're having this conversation around Indigenous research led by Indigenous researchers, for us, by us. But I think of the challenge also, and I've encountered this, where on the Indigenous side, the value of Indigenous knowledge is perhaps discounted by that process of colonization, where they feel that they're very knowledgeable people in ways of knowing and being, but it's been discounted or discredited for so long that they don't see or appreciate the tremendous value of their knowledge. So one of our challenges. I'm going to move on to our next question. Okay. I love the idea of a course of, as the panelists have mentioned, how might we explore cost-effective ways of teaching this?
Find us the funding, Rob. we can get it started. You know, I think one is that we should never be asking elders or knowledge keepers to be discounting their services. So I think that when we're working with elders and knowledge keepers, we have to ensure that there is adequate funding for them. So that said, I think that we can look towards partnerships. I think that we can look towards using some of the resources that are out there and working with communities so that you know, we can find ways that we can build a course that is cost effective to the university, but at the same time does not sort of ask individuals or communities to take a sacrifice for others' learning.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, 100%. You know, our elders and our knowledge keepers need to be respected for their time and their experiences, their lived experiences and their knowledge. And so thank you for bringing that up. And also, if I could add to that, we kind of have it. I think we're living in a unique time where this can actually become more and more easy to do. Technology is, you know, the past 2 years has taught us that we can do a lot of things in communities virtually. So you can't do everything, but when it comes to engaging elders, you can do that virtually sometimes. So you don't have to bring, you know, travel costs and all of that. That's something that could be a way to lower, trying to be cost effective. And we've actually seen this integrated into the Department of Education in the province of New Brunswick through a system called the World of Wisdom, which is a virtual tool where language speakers are going into classrooms virtually and teaching Mi'kmaq and Wolastoqey language to high school students. And so they're sitting in front of, you know, there's the tech support side of, you know, but then there's also, you know, the language keeper would sit in front of their computer and teach a whole class of 30 kids, you know, introduction to Mi'kmaq or what have you. And it's really an exciting initiative, and it's called the World of Wisdom. And the Department of Education houses that system. And there's also other things. And then when it comes to entrepreneurial education, which is what I do as a sessional instructor with UNB, it's all experiential. And so just encouraging students in their process of going out and interviewing potential customers, understanding the market, doing that hands-on work that we encourage people to do in entrepreneurship courses. Just include the Indigenous communities in that. Understand where they are, and encourage your students to reach out to if there is an economic development arm of that community, or and include them in their data gathering for their entrepreneurial ventures. That would be really in a cost-effective way to incorporate Indigenous perspectives into entrepreneurial education as well. So I hope that helps, Rob. But
great idea.
And we'll talk.
Yeah.
Great. Yes. And you mentioned pivoting online. It reminded me of the course that's offered out of the University of Alberta, and I regret I don't remember the exact name of it. It was like Indigenous People 101, and it really became, I think it went viral after a couple of Hollywood A-listers enrolled in this free course. So we know there are low-cost solutions, but that shouldn't be our target. What I thought of, Rob, was if we look at business schools as the feeder stream to corporate Canada, that corporate Canada has a role to play, because in effect, you're creating their future leaders and having this diversity of thought or this richness of understanding of the cultural fabric of this country enhances the bottom line. So they should be contributing to this. And I thought also the philanthropic world we could tap into. But I want to get to our last question. Time is flying here. We've got 3 minutes, gentlemen.
Okay.
Last question is, we talk about often making decisions and thinking ahead of the next 7 generations. We hear this often in the Indigenous world. So what do we hope business education looks like in 100 years? So in 2122, even feels crazy kind of saying that. What is business education going to look like?
So just quickly, Indigenous led, that you go to an Indigenous school, that in 100 years, that the school is not a building in an urban area, but the school's in a community somewhere, or is in multiple communities, but it's an Indigenous run, with Indigenous knowledge as the primary, and then we can maybe have a mandatory course on Western learning.
Flip the script. There you go.
Mike.
Boy, that's a really tough question. But I really think, I think something that, again, education as a whole, post-secondary education, has to consider is real world. We talked about it a little bit, but real world impact, real world experiences, building those opportunities for students to have actual on the ground work, not just classroom based experiences, so that when they come through, business education, I think in 100 years is not going to be, a 4 or 5 year degree program. I think it's going to be much more micro-credentialed. I think it's going to be much more specific and targeted, and to what the market demands. I think that's really helpful for adult learners, because it's not like you're sacrificing 4 or 5 years of your life but you can be micro-credentialed and go into the area that you want to be an expert in. And that helps us as Indigenous peoples as well. And the financial barriers that we face as Indigenous peoples to education, some of those challenges can be alleviated by both micro-credentialing, doing things in an innovative way, doing things on the land, experientially. And that's what I hope business education looks like 100 years from now. 500 years, I don't know. We'll be riding around on flying saucers. I don't know.
It's in the moon.
I'll just add my 2 cents before we wrap up. I see business education in 100 years rooted in connection to land, meaning sustainability, that we're not hurting the land and being extractive and short-term thinking, but all our interactions with the land are based on sustainability, that it's going to be here for the next 500 years. Very counter to what we're seeing today. So I'm going to start to wrap up, and I want to say thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Todd. Thank you, Mike. What a rich conversation we've had. I'd also like to thank the UNB faculty, School of Management, and UNB Faculty of Business for asking me to host today's conversation. It's been fun. It's been informative, some laughs. Just to remind you that the University of New Brunswick and Dalhousie University are working with their counterparts across Atlantic Canada, as well as with Atlantic Business Magazine, to raise funds for this new Promise Scholarship and bursaries. I encourage all our viewers today, if you can, please donate and join our collective efforts to contribute towards economic reconciliation. And by all means, let's keep this conversation going in a good way. If you want to reach out to our participants, I believe we're all on LinkedIn, continuing to have these important conversations. Thank you.